wait to see how cool I was. Come on, hurry up. Time's wasted.
Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animated features not made by Disney. I'm your host, Octaviano, and today I'm talking about a movie that if you're around my age, you probably saw on Cartoon Network. If you're not around my age, there's a good chance you might never have seen it, even though you've probably heard of the cartoon. And that is Dexter's Laboratory Ego Trip, the Dexter's Lab movie. This is one that, honestly, I haven't seen in years. I don't know if Cartoon Network even reruns the thing, Boomerang or whoever, if they still rerun it, because this is a thing where I'm like, the last time I remember watching this was back when Dexter's Lab was currently running. So, about 20 years ago. I mean, sure, the show has had its reruns through Boomerang, and even Cartoon Network at times, over the years. So, you would imagine that this movie is still fairly well seen. But the thing is, I don't know if it's ever actually been officially released in any kind of physical matter. Maybe VHS, but even then I'm not too sure if it ever was. I certainly didn't see it in a physical thing. I had to pretty much look it up online, and lo and behold, I found it. Wasn't too hard, but it's still one of those things where it's like, yeah, this is one that I'm not sure how many people have seen, specifically those who didn't really grow up with the show in terms of, when it was still running. For those of you who are unaware of Dexter's Laboratory, it's a Cartoon Network show, often considered to be one of the first, if not the first show. There's kind of a confusing area with that. And it's a show about a boy genius who has like the secret lab in his house. The parents don't know about it. Most people don't know about it except his sister does, Dee Dee, who tends to screw around in there. Dexter has a rival named Mandark, which honestly, even to this day, I still remember his laugh pretty well. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, and then he interacts with other stuff. I mean, technically speaking, even though he keeps the lab secret from people, it's one of those things where it's like, well, I mean, how many people really do, are unaware of it? Because, there's times where it's like, oh, the Blue Falcon, like the old Hanna-Barbera character shows up and asks for his help, and he's already aware of it. He has a music teacher in one episode, and he's able to get into the lab. Just a bunch of characters who are fairly aware of, Dexter being a genius and whatnot. So most of the time it just feels like it's the parents who are completely oblivious to this stuff. But, that's the central premise. It's kind of like, if you were born later, like the Nickelodeon show Jimmy Neutron, only I'd honestly argue that this show was way better, not just because it was the one that I saw at a younger age, but also because it's just a smarter show. There's, it's 2D, and that's always going to have a bigger place in my heart than CG. And it's just more creative. I mean, it really did go wild with it, but, it's, it is what it is. I'm not here to really argue over, Jimmy Neutron versus Dexter's Lab, but I still say Dexter's Lab was my show. This movie, Ego Trip, which is one that, when I first saw it as a kid, which, should tell you how far back, how long it's been since I've seen this, I didn't really get the title of it, because, when I was younger, I thought it was Eagle, like the bird, Trip, not Ego Trip. So it wasn't until rewatching this where I'm like, oh, okay, so that's why it's called Ego Trip. Okay, because basically the central premise of this is that Dexter faces some robots that travel from the future to destroy the one who saves the future, as they say. So, Dexter defeats them and quickly comes to the conclusion like, well, okay, if they showed up here to attack someone who saved the future, then that clearly means that I saved the future. So I want to go to the future and see how exactly I do that. And he goes through this whole trip where he's time traveling and meeting various versions of himself to just figure out how exactly did he save the future and what exactly he saves it from. It's kind of predictable, but it's still kind of fun just seeing how it gets there. And yeah, I'll say that much. This is a very fun TV movie. It runs fairly short. It's only about 50 minutes long, but it's a very fun little TV movie, especially for something that was done at its time. Because here's the thing, I know a lot of people take this for granted now because, with the rise of Netflix and just, all these other streaming services, movies that don't hit theaters weren't always good. I mean, granted, you know, even back then there was ones that, you know, were fairly enjoyable, but for the most part, if your movie was going straight to TV or whatever, there was a high chance that it was going to be bad. And if it wasn't bad, it's one of those things where it has a caveat where it's basically like, okay, this is fine if you're a fan of this certain thing, like if you're a fan of this cartoon or this kind of story. So yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, if your movie didn't make it to the big screen, it was probably bad. Nowadays, it's a lot different. There's a lot of movies that don't hit the big screen, and not just because of COVID, it's just been like that for years now, that are generally good or much better than stuff that are hitting theaters. Like, you know, last year, granted, this was because of COVID, we had The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which, as far as I'm concerned, way better than anything that we got in actual big screens. And I know that technically got limited release, like a limited release, but I'm talking about, like, you know, wide releases, because, you know, even nowadays, some straight-to-video stuff gets special, like, Fathom events or stuff like that where they hit theaters. But yeah, going back to the Dexter's Lab thing, it's a really fun, you know, special. Well, special movie, whatever. It's a really fun one. It's entertaining. It's well done. It's well plotted out. I do wish they could have extended some parts just to get more creative out of it. But, you know, for the most part, it's like, if you are not a fan of Dexter's Lab, I can imagine that you might be able to enjoy this just fine, because it doesn't really require too much. Like, it kind of perfectly sets itself up right at the start of the movie, because you get, like, the rival Mandark coming in. He goes into the lab, and, you know, Dexter defeats him. Dee Dee shows up, screws around a bit, disappears, and then Dexter does his own thing. And that's kind of what the show was. You had a lot of fun little sci-fi adventure, type stories. You could just see the love for, like, a lot of, like, you know, like, earlier, like, comic book stuff in this show, because it's not apparent in the movie, but in the show, you would have, like, special, not specials, but, like, short segments where it was focused on, like, Dexter's pet superhero monkey, or a group of superheroes that were pretty much like the Avengers, but if the Avengers were roommates at some apartment, and there was always, like, fun little stuff like that. But yeah, like, this movie doesn't really require you to be a fan of the show. I mean, it plays pretty much like a typical episode in the best ways possible, because you got, you know, like I said, Dexter going into the future, and he meets various versions of himself, so you won't be lost if you've never seen the show. Some stuff will, like, of course, hit harder if you have, because you get, like, okay, there, you know, Mandark has, like a crush on Dexter's sister, so you get that whole thing where it's like, oh, okay, so Dexter's sister now has, you know, something that, you know, makes Mandark weak, whatever. It's just little stuff like that, but, you know, it's great, because at first when I was rewatching this, I was worried that it might not work too well, because the problem with a lot of these TV movies, even regular, you know, theatrical movies for shows, is that they do heavily rely on, like, okay, let's try to cram in as much references as possible, to a point that it kind of loses the plot. This one is like, no, it's from beginning to end, it's just focused on this one story, and it doesn't slow down just to be like, oh, remember this episode from the show? That was great. Or, hey, were you fans of this character? Let's put that in. Like, you know, Dee Dee is in the movie, but she's gets, like, maybe one or two lines, and she's, you know, only in there for the opening and the ending, which is all she really needed to do, and it, you know, relates to the plot. Dexter's parents are pretty much only there for the opening. Again, they only get, like, one or two lines, so don't really need them, and it's, you know, just a way to be like, okay, so this is family, but it just doesn't matter. Like, most of the movie, funny enough, which is something that I didn't really realize until rewatching this, is that most of the movie is just Dexter talking to himself. Like, it's the actress, I believe it was Catherine Cavanaugh, who sadly has passed away, so rest in peace. It's most of the time just her talking to herself in various places, with the occasional appearance of Mandark coming in, because he's, of course, the villain in this one. And that's it, and it's great. You know, it really is a fun little, it really is a fun little short movie about time travel, and, you know, this egotistical little brat trying to figure out how exactly his genius is what saves the universe or saves the world, whatever, in the future. And funny enough, it's one of those things where it's like, you slowly realize, like, all of this happens because he decided to be an egotistical little brat and go to the future. Like, granted, maybe stuff would have gone bad regardless, just because they do get some instances where it's like, okay, Mandark one-ups him at some point, and that kind of screws him over. But realistically, Mandark really, is showcased even more so than Dexter to be just this incompetent guy who gets lucky. Because the only thing that he really does that where it's like, okay, without Dexter time traveling, this probably wouldn't have changed, is that Mandark does eventually become the head of this corporation just because he steals Dexter's ideas and, bullies him into submission, pretty much. Like, Dexter becomes a wimp in one of the timelines, because you pretty much got like 4 different versions of Dexter. You got the regular version, the kid version that we know, you got his early adult years, like I'd assume it's probably like in his 20s, where he's a wimp, tall, skinny wimp. Then you get really far out future version where it's like the old man Dexter, and if you've seen episodes where Dexter turns himself old, that's pretty much what it is. And then you got this buffed up future rebel Dexter, who's pretty much like, okay, this is maybe around his 30s or 40s, where the world's gone to shit because Dexter, through time traveling, kind of left behind this important thing that Mandark takes, and is able to make people dumb, so he pretty much rules the world. And Dexter is one of the few people, if not the only person, that survived because he had gone underground after so much shame and became this muscle-bound guy. And it's like the only version of Dexter that's not voiced by the voice actress. It's instead by I believe Jeff Bennett, doing the voice. And it's all just fun. It's the kind of thing where I'm like, yeah, this is where I'm like, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more just to further explore these characters. I mean, it's tightly done, and in a way I do get why they went with the way they did it, because, at a certain point it will get a little tiresome. But, for what it is, it was really creative and it was really fun. I don't know, it was definitely something. Like I was gonna say earlier, while rewatching this, I was afraid that it wouldn't hold up. It did kind of start off that way, because in the first 10 minutes I was like, okay, this is going kind of nowhere. Like, because when you get introduced to the whole robots that are sent back to the past, Dexter starts fighting them and they don't fight back, which ends up being a hint for what happens later in the movie. But at that moment, it's just like, this feels like overkill because he's constantly switching out of suits, and this is the one time where it does feel it's a bit heavy on the fan service, because it's like, oh look, remember this suit, remember that suit, and I'm just like, okay, you don't need to do this overkill. Like, granted, I guess this helps set up that Dexter is egotistical because he's constantly showing off what he can do, but I feel like they could have done that a little better to where it wouldn't have felt so dragged out. But of course, on the other hand, well, even if it feels a bit dragged out, it doesn't matter, because the second the plot gets going, it really starts to get going. And again, it just is like, it's so fun that I wanted some more. Like, maybe bumping the 50 minutes to maybe a 70-minute runtime. Like, something where it was, about as long as what you would expect for a theatrical movie, a short theatrical movie by this point, which is like, like the 73-minute, hour and 13 minutes, movies. And yeah, I just had a blast with that stuff. Like the wimpy Dexter, it's kind of fun seeing like this whole cubicle world, and him, just working on cubicles, being scared of Mandark, being pretty much younger Dexter's punching bag for being such a wimp. And then you get like the old man Dexter, who, I mean, if you've ever seen that episode where he turns himself old, it's just as funny as that. The both Dexter is like, again, would have liked to have seen more, because it's just a lot of great stuff with like, the voice actor, trying to mimic Dexter's voice, and just having like this whole buffed up, like, if it wasn't for the fact that it's Dexter, you would assume that he's like, this great hero. Instead, he's just an egotistical brat, only now in a buffed up body. And of course, it's just funny picturing that, going from that to the old man. But it's just all really fun. I do like Mandark as a villain here, because whether it's his younger self, the businessman version, the brain, because for this one it's like, okay, so his old man version is just his brain in a jar, and you kind of realize why that happens. And then you got like the really fat overlord Mandark. Again, really fun stuff. And for a TV movie, especially one that was done way back then, the animation is pretty neat. I mean, granted, Dexter's Lab's animation was always pretty neat. It definitely is noticeable that it is a TV production, so not much you can do on that. The version I saw was apparently someone who did like a 4K remaster on that, which is, great, good job on that. But it's just the style, like the look of the world, the look of the designs of the machines and stuff like that really makes it stand out. Because that's what makes a big difference for this compared to something like the Loud House movie. Think of another TV show movie with that Loud House one, which again I didn't even hate that one. It was very noticeable that the animation wasn't really a theatrical quality. I mean, some of the movement was a little more bouncy than what I would expect from TV, but then again, I don't watch TV too often now, so I don't know, maybe that's the standard now. Either way, it didn't really have much of an interesting style for me to be like, okay, that's kind of neat, like Dexter did, where it's like, okay, yeah, I can tell that this is TV quality, but it's just the look of it that is really neat, and it's the kind of thing where I'm like, look, I wouldn't even mind watching this on a big screen, even though it's definitely not something that was made for it. It has a cool look, and it's enough for me to be like, yeah, that's fun. And again, it is one where I'm like, I would have liked to have seen more. I don't know if it would have been able to actually sustain it, but, I have hopes that it could. And, it's clear as, getting Tartakovsky's first movie, he would later do like the Hotel Transylvania movies, which, are fun movies. And this one is no different. It really is clever. It's, got some fun jokes, like, again, like the different versions of him. Dexter constantly belittling his other forms, except for like the buffed up one, just because it's like, hey, look, this is the one that I think is cool. And then, of course, just realizing that, okay, this could have all been avoided if you bothered, just asking the robots who were sent to attack him to clarify who saved the future. And this is kind of spoiler territory, so if you don't want to watch this part, I get it, but, just keep in mind that this is not that hard to figure out. But, you got Dee Dee, who disappears early on in the movie through the time travel machine, and she doesn't return until the very end to reveal she's the one who saved the future. And instead of Dexter just being proud of it and just being like, oh, look, at least, the day was saved. And, realistically, since his future self is considered a hero, it means that Dexter still ended up getting the credit for saving the world. But that doesn't matter because Dee Dee pushed the button, which made her no savior of the world. And to Dexter's eyes, it's like, okay, so she deserves to go because of that. So Dexter ends up creating the robots that he destroyed in the beginning. And of course, this leads to a great joke where Dexter, after, time traveling back and, realizing what he did, is all like, wait a second, if this was the future and this is what ended up happening, then does that mean that, oh, you know what? Forget it. I don't want to talk about it. Time travel is confusing. And that's pretty much what it is. Like, he just, tries explaining it and he just goes like, oh, never mind. It's too confusing. Forget it. Fuck it. Let's end it here. So, that's great. I mean, realistically, the whole thing is just a ton of fun. I love how a lot of this is pretty much just Dexter talking to himself for, the 15 minutes. Occasionally Mandark interrupts and, beyond that, you get one or two characters who get like a line or two. All great, solid stuff. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I got much more to say. This is a pretty simple review, I think. Like I said, animation, great, even if it's TV quality. The writing, it's fun. The characters are fun. It does drag itself at the start of the movie, but, once it gets going, it's well worth it. And once it got going, it did make me wish that, okay, maybe we could have dragged on with some of these scenes a little more, just to have some more creative stuff in there. Or hopefully, have a person who had more involvement with it do something about it. Because that's the other thing, is like, you got these projects that are being done by people who have no real interest in them or whatever. So it's obvious that they come out bad, but every now and then you got something like this where it's made by people passionate about the stuff, in this case the creator, and it's just a really clever story, even if you're not a fan of the show specifically. It's gonna do for you pretty well. I certainly enjoy it 20 years later. Watching it again, it's definitely a fun movie to watch. I would like to see more, but I'm not gonna complain about what I did get. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for listening. This has been Octaviano Macias. See ya.
Goodbye, Dexter.
Goodbye, Dexter. Goodbye, Dexter. Goodbye, Dexter.
Thank you for coming on and listening to me today. If you enjoyed it, you can always subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can follow my podcast. It's on Podbean, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And if you want to support me even more, there's always the option of Patreon. Patreon is a great way to support artists. And with that, you can always put in $1 or even more. It's all up to you. All just to help produce the show and other things I may do. Thank you again, and I hope to see you in the coming future.